are Team 1 and today I'm going to present the technical walkthrough of our application Mapper. So let's get started. This is the agenda and let's start with the project overview first. So what exactly is Mapper? So Mapper is a Visual Studio Code extension which is designed to help developers understand a large JavaScript and TypeScript code bases. So instead of manually tracing imports or jumping between dozens of files, Mapper visualizes the structure of a project through folder level, file level, and function level graphs right inside the editor. And then, along with structure, Mapper computes several useful software metrics like cyclomatic complexity, maintainability index, logical lines of code, and also duplication percentage. It also contains Git based metrics such as churn, ownership, last modified history, and much more. And these metrics give quick insight into code quality and hotspots in the project. So the extension, these are the code, some of the code features of the extension as I mentioned earlier. And then the extension is built with TypeScript using the VS Code extension API. Here, Esprit handles AST parsing, ES complex, and Typhoon JS. It computes complexity and maintainability. JSCPD identifies duplicated code, and Cytoscape JS is basically used to power the interactive graph visualization in the web view. So, this slide basically gives the big picture of what Mapper does and why it's useful. In the next part, I'll show where the repository lives and basically how do we run the extension locally. So, this project is hosted on GitHub and getting it running locally is very straightforward. After cloning the repository and installing dependencies with npm install, you can just launch the extension by pressing F5 in VS Code. This opens a separate extension host window where Mapper appears as an icon in the activity bar. Now, because the extension activates automatically on startup, you can open the code graph view immediately. Commands like test generate graph and refresh metrics are available for testing. So this setup makes the extension easy to evaluate, and it ensures that anyone reviewing it can reproduce this environment with very minimal steps. So let me give you a high level folder tour of our repo. So basically, at the top level of the project, the .github folder contains our CI/CD workflows, automation scripts, and pull request template. The VS Code folder includes debugging configuration, which are used during local development. The admin folder stores sprint reviews, retrospectives, and project management documentation. Assets contain relevant images which are and screenshots which are used for presentations and documentations. And then specs folder contains ADRs, research node, and scaffold documents that were created during the brainstorming part of the application. And then the most important folder is SRC, which is basically the heart of this application. It contains the full extension implementation, the metrics engine, analysis logic, WebView UI, tests, all the type definitions, and key entry files like extension.ds and relationship analyzer. So once you compile the code, the JavaScript output goes into the out folder, and then also there are other files that sits on the root like package.json, tsconfig, and linting configs, which defines a build system and tooling. So this is basically a high level map of the repo before we dive deeper into the architecture. So let's go ahead to the architecture diagram of Mapper. So this diagram shows how the major components of Mapper fit together inside VS Code. So once the user open Mapper, extension.ts activates and it sets up the metric service, the indexing service, relationship analyzer, and graph view provider. Now this wiring step defines how the extension bootstraps. Now the indexing service scans the workspace for JavaScript and TypeScript files. and sets up file watchers to listen for changes. So, which means that whenever a file is added, removed, or modified, the service reindexes that file, so the metrics remains current. Now, metric service here is responsible for gathering all the metric data. It basically queries the complexity provider, duplication provider, and the Git provider, and then it merges all the result and caches them to avoid recomputation and recomputate recomputing of the expensive metrics. Now, the relationship analyzer here builds the project structural representation by parsing ASTs to understand import relationships and function call behavior. So once the analysis is done, the graph view provider prepares a unified graph model and sends it to the web view. So graph view provider is basically the bridge between the front end and the back end. Now, inside our front end web view, graph.html and JS renders the graph using Cytoscape. And when the user interacts, such as if they switch modes or they drill into a file, the UI sends messages back to the extension, which updates the graph accordingly. So, this separation between activation, indexing, metric computation, analysis, and visualization keeps the system very modular and maintainable. So let's move on to the deep dive of our front end and the back end components. So now Mapper's entire user interface is built inside a VS Code web view. The graph view provider, it creates the web view, it loads graph.html, CSS, and graph.js, and it sends the initial graph data to the front end. It, again, as I mentioned, also listens from messages which is sent back from the web view, such as when the user changes mode or selects a file to drill down into. Now, graph.html defines the static structure. It includes including the graph container, your breadcrumb navigation, and then also the view mode drop down here and the metrics panel, which is here down below. And then all this dynamic behavior lives inside of graph.js. It basically initializes Cytoscape, it receives graph updates from the backend, and it handles node interactions such as highlighting related nodes, drilling into file level or function level graphs, and also updating the metric panel. It also sends messages back to the extension whenever the UI needs new data. Now, styling and theming are all handled in graph.css. It defines basically the layout, themes, and very detailed metrics tooltip. So, together, these components form the interactive visualization layer that the user sees. And the backend is basically responsible for all the heavy lifting, and front end entirely focuses on rendering and the interaction part. Okay, so let's understand how can someone extend or maintain Mapper. In this section, I'll walk through how someone new to the project can quickly understand, maintain, or extend Mapper. So the primary entry point is this file extension.ts. This file sets up everything: the metric service, the indexing service, the relationship analyzer, and the graph view provider. Anyone taking over the code base should start here because it explains how the system boots up inside VS Code. The next key file is the graphviewprovider.ts. It sits between the backend and the web view. So it loads our here. If you see here, it loads our HTML and JavaScript. It listens to messages from the front end, and then it also sends updated graph models back. So here, if you see it receives like different sort of messages, which is ready if they want to change the view mode, showing the function graph, and opening the file when you are clicking on a node. So if you want to add a new user interaction or modify how the UI communicates with the backend, so this is the file that you want to work in. Now, extended metrics is very straightforward. To add a new metric provider, you simply drop a new provider class into the metric provider and register it in the metric service setup inside the extension.ts. So that is here. If you want to add, let's say, a new provider, you are just going to simply add a new provider inside this metric providers list. So the next thing is, as long as it implements get file metrics and get function metrics, the pipeline will automatically merge it with the other metrics. Now, adding new modes or modifying the graph structure involves both sides: the front end in graph.js and the back end in the relationship analyzer here. So these are the two files that are responsible for that. So let's say if you want to add a class level mode, you would update the UI controls in the web view, then implement the structure building logic inside this relationship analyzer files. And then updating the UI itself is almost handled entirely in graph.js and graph.css. So basically, here if you can see all the cytoscape styles, node shapes and colors and tooltips, and also the side panels all live here. The visualization is intentionally isolated so that UI changes does not affect the backend logic. And also commands can be updated. If you want to add some new commands, it can be updated here in package.json, and then we wire them into the extension.ts file. This allows new feature like refreshing metrics or jumping between different graphs. And finally, if someone new is taking over, we recommend reading the project in this order: the first start by extension.ts, then graph view provider, followed by relationship analyzer, metric services, and finally the front end graph code. So this order gives a very clear understanding of the flow from activation to analysis, metrics, and then finally visualization. Okay, so to wrap up, here are some of the key technical aspects that we would like everyone to focus on that makes Mapper an amazing application, both from the user standpoint and also from the developer standpoint. So the system is built with a very clean modular architecture that separates indexing, metrics, analysis, and visualization into well-defined layers. This makes the code base easier to understand, maintain, and also extend. The metric pipeline is fully pluggable, which allows new metric to be added with minimal changes by implementing a provider interface. And then the performance is addressed through incremental indexing and metric caching, which keeps the extension responsive even on larger projects. The front end and back end communicate through a structured message passing model, ensuring that UI interactions remain smooth while analysis runs asynchronously. And then finally, the repository is organized with clear entry points and documentation, which makes it very straightforward for new contributors to navigate and take over the project. So overall, Mapper demonstrates a complete scalable VS Code extension that combines analysis, metrics, and visualization into a very cohesive developer tool. So thank you everyone.